A small figure appeared at the door of one of America's most feared motorcycle clubs. A little girl, tears streaming down her face, gasping for breath. Her words would shake even the toughest men to their core. "They beat my mama." What happened next became one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of biker culture. A tale of unexpected heroism, street justice, and a brotherhood that revealed a side the world rarely sees. This is a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about Hell's Angels. Stay until the end, because what these men did will leave you speechless. It was a Thursday evening in late September 1997. The air in Oakland, California carried that distinct coolness that comes when summer finally surrenders to fall. Inside the Hell's Angels clubhouse on Foothill Boulevard, the atmosphere was typical for the Brotherhood. The smell of motor oil mixed with cigarette smoke hung in the air. Chrome gleamed under fluorescent lights as members worked on their bikes, the sound of wrenches and occasional laughter filling the space. This clubhouse had stood in this neighborhood for over 2 decades. Its walls had seen celebrations, funerals, business meetings, and countless stories that would never be told outside these doors. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a single-story structure with barred windows and reinforced doors. But everyone in the neighborhood knew what it represented: respect, fear, and an unwritten code that outsiders could never fully understand. Tommy Reaper Morrison sat at the bar, a veteran member in his mid-40s with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 30 years riding with the club. His weathered face and grey beard gave him an appearance that matched his reputation, tough as nails, but fair in his own way. Next to him, 3 younger members were arguing about carburetors, their voices rising and falling in that easy manner of men who'd known each other for years. The knock came just after 7 in the evening. Not the heavy pounding of someone demanding entry, but something different, light, desperate, frantic, the kind of knock that doesn't belong at a clubhouse door. Reaper looked up first, his instincts honed by decades of reading situations before they fully developed. The other members fell silent. Another knock came, more urgent this time, accompanied by a sound that made every man in that room freeze, a child crying. Big John, the sergeant-at-arms, a man who stood 6'5" and weighed nearly 300 pounds of muscle, moved toward the door. His hand instinctively went to his waist, a habit born from years of being ready for anything. But when he looked through the peephole, his expression changed entirely. He turned back to the room, and his voice carried a tone none of them had heard from him before, confusion mixed with concern. "It's a little girl," he said. "Can't be more than 7 or 8 years old. She's alone." The door opened slowly, and there she stood, a small African-American girl wearing a pink t-shirt with cartoon characters on it, torn at the shoulder. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. Her small chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, having clearly run a distance that would tire even an adult. Before anyone could speak, the words tumbled out of her mouth in a desperate rush. "Please, you have to help. They're beating my mama. He's gonna kill her. Please." The room transformed in an instant. Every instinct these hardened men possessed shifted from their evening routine to high alert. Reaper was on his feet before the girl finished speaking. Big John knelt down to the child's level, his massive frame somehow gentle as he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Slow down, sweetheart," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Tell us what happened. Where's your mama?" The girl's words came between sobs. Her name was Keisha. She lived 6 blocks away with her mother, Sarah, and Sarah's boyfriend, Marcus. For months, things had been getting worse. Marcus drank. He yelled. He hit. Tonight, it had escalated beyond anything Keisha had ever witnessed. She described how Marcus had come home already drunk, how an argument started over something trivial, how the first slap turned into punches, how her mother had screamed at her to run, to get help, to go anywhere, and in her panic running through streets she barely knew in the growing darkness, Keisha had remembered something her mother once told her. Mama said if anything really bad ever happened, the men with the motorcycles would help. She said they don't let bad things happen to women and kids in this neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that room. These were men that society labeled as outlaws, criminals, dangerous elements to be feared and avoided. Yet here was a child, desperate and terrified, who'd run to them because somewhere in her young mind she believed they represented safety. Reaper looked around the room at his brothers. No words needed to be spoken. The code was clear. Whatever else they were, whatever laws they'd bent or broken in their lives, there were lines you didn't cross. Hitting women, hurting kids, minutes. Those weren't just crimes, they were violations of something fundamental. "How many people in the house?" Reaper asked Keisha, his tone businesslike but not harsh. "Just him and Mama," she answered, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "Anyone else around? Neighbors? Mrs. Patterson next door, but she's old, and the Johnsons on the other side, but they don't never do nothing when he yells." Reaper nodded slowly. He'd seen this pattern before. Domestic violence thriving in the silence of neighbors who heard everything but did nothing. People who convinced themselves it wasn't their business, that they shouldn't get involved. The same people who would later claim they never knew it was that bad. Within minutes, the clubhouse transformed into something resembling a military operation. Reaper made the calls. 3 more members who lived nearby were contacted. Chains, a mechanic by trade, and one of the club's most level-headed members, arrived within 5 minutes. Spider, who'd served in the Marines before joining the club, came right behind him. The plan was simple. They would ride to the address. They would assess the situation. They would intervene. And if Marcus wanted to fight someone, he'd finally face opponents who could fight back. Big John stayed behind with Keisha, calling one of the old ladies, the term the club used for wives and long-term girlfriends of members, to come sit with the girl. Within 10 minutes, Reaper's wife, Linda, arrived. She'd been married to Reaper for 23 years and had seen her share of the club's business, but even she was shaken by the sight of the terrified child. As Linda wrapped a blanket around Keisha and started making her hot chocolate, 8 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared to life in the parking lot. The sound was thunder. It was a warning. It was a promise. Reaper led the pack. Behind him rode men with nicknames earned through years of loyalty and deeds both noble and questionable. Chains, Spider, Tiny, who stood 6'8", Hammer, Preacher, who'd earned his name not from religion, but from his tendency to lecture anyone who broke the club's code. Ghost, and Tank, the youngest of the group at 29, but already proving himself worthy of the patch on his back. They rolled out onto Foothill Boulevard as the sun dipped below the Oakland Hills, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Residents on the street stopped and watched. Some pulled out phones, others just stared. A Hells Angels convoy wasn't unusual in this area, but there was something different about this one, something purposeful, something that made people who saw it instinctively know that someone, somewhere, was about to face serious consequences. The ride took less than 5 minutes, but in that time, each man prepared himself mentally for what was coming. They'd been in fights before, they'd handled club business that required force, but this was different. This wasn't about territory or respect or club politics. This was about a little girl who'd run into the night, terrified and desperate, trusting them to do what needed to be done. As they turned onto Keisha's street, a quiet residential block lined with small houses built in the 50s, the sound of their engines echoed off the buildings. Curtains moved in windows. The neighborhood was watching. Reaper raised his fist, the signal to slow down. They rolled to a stop 3 houses away from the address Keisha had given them. The engines cut off one by one, leaving only the sound of the evening and, barely audible in the distance, the sound of a man's voice raised in anger. Before they moved forward, Reaper gathered his brothers in a tight circle on the street. This wasn't just about charging in with fists flying. There were considerations, legal ones, practical ones, and moral ones that, despite their outlaw status, these men took seriously. "Listen up," Reaper said, keeping his voice low. "We know what we heard from the kid, but we need to be smart about this. Spider, you and Ghost circle around back. Make sure this piece of trash doesn't try to run. Chains, you're with me at the front door. The rest of you, perimeter. If cops show up, which they probably will, let me do the talking." Back at the clubhouse, Linda was learning more of Keisha's story. As the hot chocolate warmed the girl's hands and her breathing slowly steadied, the full picture began to emerge. It was a picture as heartbreaking as it was familiar, a story that played out in countless homes across America, hidden behind closed doors and covered up by shame and fear. Keisha's mother, Sarah Johnson, was 32 years old. She'd grown up in Oakland, graduated from high school with dreams of becoming a nurse, but life had taken her down a different path. She'd had Keisha young, at 24, with a man who'd left before the baby was born. For years, it had been just the two of them. Sarah worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She cleaned offices at night. She worked retail during the day. She did everything she could to give her daughter a better life than she'd had. Then, 2 years ago, she met Marcus Wheeler at a friend's barbecue. He was charming at first, attentive. He had a job in construction, made decent money, and seemed stable. He was good with Keisha, or at least he pretended to be. After 6 months of dating, he moved into their small 2-bedroom house. At first, things were fine. Better than fine. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she had a partner, someone to share the burden. But slowly, things changed. Marcus started drinking more. The construction job became sporadic. He'd go days without work, then blow his paycheck at the bar. The charm turned to criticism. Sarah worked too much. She didn't pay enough attention to him. The house wasn't clean enough. The food wasn't good enough. Nothing was ever good enough. The first time he pushed her, Sarah told herself it was an accident. He'd been drunk. He didn't mean it. He apologized the next day with flowers and promises. The second time, he slapped her during an argument. Again, apologies. Again, promises. The third time, he punched her hard enough to leave a bruise she had to cover with makeup for a week. Each incident escalated. Each time, Sarah convinced herself it would be the last. She made excuses to herself, to Keisha, to her co-workers who sometimes noticed the bruises. She was afraid of being alone, afraid of the financial burden of supporting herself and Keisha without help, afraid of what Marcus might do if she tried to leave. Keisha watched it all. She watched her mother become smaller, quieter, more afraid. She heard the arguments through her bedroom walls. She saw the bruises her mother tried to hide. She felt the tension that filled their home like smoke, choking and inescapable. The neighbors heard too. Mrs. Patterson, the 78-year-old widow next door, had called the police twice. Both times, officers arrived, knocked on the door, and left after Marcus and Sarah both claimed everything was fine. No visible injuries, no one pressing charges, nothing the police could do. The Johnsons, on the other side, had 4 kids of their own and convinced themselves that getting involved would only make things worse, that it was a private matter, that it wasn't their place. Tonight had started like too many others. Marcus came home at 6, already drunk from happy hour at some dive bar downtown. He was angry about something at work, something about his supervisor disrespecting him. Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner, tired from her shift at the department store. Keisha was in the living room, trying to focus on her homework, despite the growing tension she could feel building. The argument started over the dinner. Chicken was too dry. Rice wasn't seasoned right. Sarah apologized, offered to make something else, but Marcus was looking for a fight, and nothing she said or did was going to prevent it. The first slap knocked Sarah against the kitchen counter. Keisha heard the sound from the living room and froze, her pencil hovering over her math worksheet. She'd heard this before, many times, but something about tonight felt different, worse. "You think you're so much better than me," Marcus yelled, his words slurred but filled with venom. "Working your little jobs? Acting like you don't need me?" Sarah tried to calm him down, her voice shaking. "Marcus, please, not in front of Keisha. Let's just talk about this." But talking was over. The second hit was a closed fist to Sarah's face. She fell to the floor. Keisha appeared in the kitchen doorway, tears already streaming down her face. "Leave my mama alone!" she screamed, her small voice breaking. Marcus turned to her, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than anything before. He took a step toward Keisha. That's when Sarah did something she'd never done before. She got up, put herself between Marcus and her daughter, and told Keisha to run. "Get out of here, baby, run! Go get help!" Keisha hesitated for just a second, watching her mother take another hit as she blocked the doorway. Then she ran, out the front door, into the street. She didn't know where to go. She just ran, her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry her, tears blurring her vision. She passed Mrs. Patterson's house. She passed the Johnsons. She kept running, her mother's words echoing in her head from a conversation months ago. They'd been walking home from the store, and Sarah had pointed out the clubhouse as they passed. "If something ever happens to me, baby, and you need help, you go there. Those men, they look scary, but they have a code. They protect this neighborhood." At the time, Keisha hadn't understood. Now, running through the darkening streets with her heart pounding, it was the only thing she could think of. Linda listened to all of this, holding Keisha's small hand as the girl poured out the story between sobs. Big John stood nearby, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. Even for a man who'd seen violence, who'd lived a life most people would consider hard, this story hit different. This was pure cruelty. This was a coward using his size and strength to terrorize people who couldn't fight back. "Your brothers are going to help your mama," Linda told Keisha softly. "They're good at helping people. You did the right thing coming to us." Keisha looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much for her age. "Is Mama going to be okay?" Linda wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise that everything would be fine, but she'd been around the club long enough to know better than to make promises she couldn't keep. Instead, she said, "The men are doing everything they can, and they don't give up. Not ever." Back on the street, Reaper and his brothers were positioned and ready. They could hear the commotion from inside the house now. A man's voice, loud and aggressive, the sound of something breaking, and underneath it all, a woman's muffled cries. Reaper looked at Chains, who nodded back. They'd known each other for over 15 years. They'd been through things together that would have broken most men. This was just another situation to handle, except it wasn't, because somewhere in each of their minds was the image of that little girl's face, streaked with tears and desperate with fear. The code was simple. You protected the neighborhood. You protected women and children. And if someone violated that code, there were consequences. Real ones. The kind that didn't involve lawyers and court dates and slaps on the wrist. Reaper raised his fist and knocked on the door. 3 heavy blows that echoed through the evening air. Inside, the yelling stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened just a crack, and Marcus Wheeler's face appeared. He was exactly what they expected. Mid-30s, disheveled, eyes bloodshot from alcohol, a sneer on his face that came from years of being the biggest, meanest guy in the room. When he saw who was standing on his porch, that sneer faltered, just for a moment. Then he tried to recover, puffing up his chest in a pathetic attempt at intimidation. "The hell do you want?" he said, trying to sound tough but already taking a step back. Reaper didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're here about Sarah," he said calmly, "and we're coming in. What do you think about what you've seen so far? We're just getting to the most intense part of this extraordinary story. Drop your thoughts in the comments." Marcus Wheeler tried to close the door. That was his first mistake. Chains put his boot in the doorway before it could shut, and the combined weight of 2 men pushing from the outside made the door swing open so fast that Marcus stumbled backward into his own living room. What Reaper and Chains saw inside confirmed everything Keisha had told them. The living room was in chaos. A lamp lay shattered on the floor. The coffee table was overturned, and there, against the far wall near the kitchen entrance, was Sarah Johnson. Her face was already swelling on one side, blood dripping from her split lip. Her blouse was torn at the collar. She looked up at the 2 bikers with an expression that mixed fear, shame, and desperate hope. "Who the hell do you think you are, breaking into my house?" Marcus yelled, his courage returning now that he was in familiar territory. His territory. "Your house?" Chains said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Your name on the lease?" Marcus's face reddened. "That's none of your damn business. Sarah, tell these thugs to get out." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. She was shaking, pressed against the wall like an animal cornered. Reaper held up a hand, and Chains fell silent. When Reaper spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath. "Here's how this is going to work, Marcus. You're going to sit down on that couch and keep your mouth shut. We're going to check on Sarah, and then we're going to have a conversation about what happens next. You can't tell me what to do in my own house." Marcus took a step forward, his fists clenched. He never saw Chains move. One moment the big biker was standing still. The next, he had Marcus by the throat, lifting him slightly off the ground and walking him backward until his back hit the wall with enough force to knock a picture frame loose. "The man said sit down," Chains growled. "So sit the hell down." He released Marcus, who dropped onto the couch gasping, his earlier bravado completely gone. His eyes darted to the door, probably calculating whether he could make a run for it. That's when he noticed the other bikers standing outside, Spider and Ghost at the back door, visible through the kitchen window, Tank and Tiny flanking the front entrance, Hammer and Preacher on the street, arms crossed, watching. He was surrounded. Whatever fight he thought he had in him evaporated in the face of 8 men who looked like they'd been carved from granite and bad intentions. Reaper moved to Sarah slowly, showing his hands, making himself non-threatening despite his appearance. "Ma'am, my name is Tommy. Your daughter came to our clubhouse asking for help. She's safe right now with my wife. Can you tell me if you need medical attention?" Sarah's eyes widened at the mention of Keisha. "She's okay? She got away? She's fine. Drinking hot chocolate and wrapped in a blanket. Smart kid. Brave kid. Gets that from her mama, I'd guess." Tears started flowing down Sarah's face, mixing with the blood from her lip. "I told her to run. I didn't know where she'd go. I just needed her out of here." "She did exactly right," Reaper said gently. "And now we're going to make sure you're safe too. Do you need an ambulance?" Sarah shook her head. "I've had worse," she said quietly, then seemed to realize what she'd admitted. The shame flooded her face again. "Hey," Reaper said, and waited until she looked at him. "None of this is your fault. You understand me? Not one bit of it." From the couch, couch, Marcus made a sound of disgust. "This is ridiculous. Sarah, baby, tell them it was an accident. Tell them we were just having an argument that got out of hand." The room went silent. Every biker in earshot turned to look at Marcus with expressions that could freeze fire. It was Chains who spoke first. "An accident," he repeated slowly. "Your fist accidentally hit her face multiple times. Is that what you're saying?" Marcus realized he'd made his second mistake. "Look, you don't understand. This is between me and her. This is a domestic situation. You can't just come in here and—" "Can't?" Preacher's voice came from the doorway. He stepped inside, his 6'4" frame filling the space. "See, that's where you're confused. We can do whatever we want. Question is what we're gonna do." Spider entered from the back, making sure Marcus saw that every exit was blocked. "Found some interesting things in the kitchen," he said to Reaper. "Empty bottles, lots of them, and holes punched in the wall. This been going on a while, hasn't it?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Reaper pulled out his phone and dialed. When someone answered, he said, "Yeah, we need a bus at—" He looked at Sarah, who gave him the address. "Domestic violence situation. Victim needs medical evaluation." "Yeah, we'll be here." "I don't need an ambulance," Sarah protested weakly. "With respect, ma'am, yes you do. You need documentation of your injuries, pictures, medical records. Trust me on this." Marcus stood up from the couch. "You can't do this. I have rights." Tiny stepped forward. The man lived up to his ironic nickname, standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that could barely fit through a standard doorway. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and Marcus sat back down. "Let's talk about rights," Reaper said, walking toward Marcus. "Your girlfriend has rights. The right to feel safe in her own home. The right not to be used as a punching bag. Your daughter has rights. The right to grow up without watching her mother get beaten. The right to have a childhood that doesn't include running through the streets, crying for help." "She's not my daughter," Marcus muttered. "Exactly," Chains said. "She's not your daughter. This isn't your house. Hell, from what I can see, you don't contribute much of anything here except violence and fear. So tell me, Marcus, what exactly do you bring to this table?" Marcus's face was red now, anger and humiliation mixing. "This is illegal. What you're doing right now is illegal. I could call the cops." "Go ahead," Reaper said, gesturing to the phone. "Call them. We already did. They'll be here soon. You can tell them all about how you beat up a woman half your size while her kid watched. I'm sure they'll be real sympathetic." The sound of sirens began in the distance, growing closer. Marcus's eyes widened. "Sarah, tell them it was an accident. Please, I'll lose my job. I'll go to jail. Baby, please." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. This man who she'd loved or thought she loved. This man who'd promised to take care of her and Keisha. This man who'd slowly transformed from charming to controlling to violent. She saw him clearly now, maybe for the first time. Stripped of his power, surrounded by men who wouldn't be intimidated, begging. "No," she said quietly. "What?" Marcus's voice cracked. "I said no." Louder this time. "I'm not covering for you anymore. I'm not making excuses. I'm not pretending this was an accident, or that I deserved it, or that it's somehow my fault. Sarah, you're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was letting this go on as long as it did, for thinking it would get better, for believing your apologies." The sirens were very close now. Red and blue lights began flashing through the windows. 2 Oakland PD cruisers pulled up, followed by an ambulance. Officers emerged, hands near their weapons when they saw the group of bikers, but Reaper stepped out with his hands visible and clear. "Officers, I'm Tommy Morrison. We received a call from this man's girlfriend's daughter about a domestic violence situation in progress. We came to check on the woman's welfare. She's inside, injured, and the perpetrator is on the couch. We've kept the scene secure for you." The lead officer, a veteran cop named Rodriguez, who'd worked this neighborhood for 15 years, knew Reaper by reputation. They'd had run-ins before, sometimes cooperative, sometimes adversarial. But Rodriguez was also a father of 3 daughters, and he recognized the situation for what it was. "Everyone stay calm," Rodriguez said. "Reaper, you and your boys step back. Let us handle this." "That's why we called you," Reaper said simply. "We're just concerned citizens." Rodriguez almost smiled at that. "Right, concerned citizens. All 8 of you." The paramedics moved to Sarah while Rodriguez and his partner entered the house. Marcus immediately started talking, a stream of excuses and accusations. The bikers were threatening him. They broke in. This was all a misunderstanding. Sarah would tell them, but Sarah didn't. For the first time in 2 years, she told the truth. All of it. The officers took photos of her injuries. They noted the damaged property. They looked at the holes in the walls that Spider had pointed out. They took statements. Marcus Wheeler was arrested for domestic violence, assault, and battery. As he was cuffed and led to the patrol car, he screamed threats at Sarah, at the bikers, at everyone. The neighbors who'd done nothing for 2 years suddenly had their phones out, recording everything. Sarah was placed in the ambulance for transport to the hospital. Before they closed the doors, she looked at Reaper. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "And please, tell Keisha I'm okay. Tell her I'm sorry she had to see all this. She's a brave kid," Reaper said. "And you're a brave woman. It takes guts to do what you just did." "I was so scared," Sarah admitted. "For so long." "I know, but scared stops tonight. You understand? This ends tonight. Thank you for sticking with this story. We know it's heavy, but the truth often is. And trust us when we say the best part is still coming. Stay with us." The ambulance pulled away with Sarah inside, sirens fading into the Oakland night. The patrol car carrying Marcus Wheeler followed behind, his face visible through the window, still yelling things no one could hear through the glass. The neighbors who'd finally emerged from their houses stood in clusters on the sidewalk, talking in hushed tones, holding their phones, recording the aftermath of a situation they'd ignored for 2 years. Officer Rodriguez approached Reaper, his expression unreadable. They stood there for a moment, two men who existed on opposite sides of the law, yet somehow found themselves on the same side tonight. "You want to tell me what really happened here?" Rodriguez asked. Reaper kept his tone neutral. "Already told you. Kid came to the clubhouse asking for help. Said her mother was being beaten. We came to check on the situation. Found the woman injured. Called you guys. That's the whole story." "Uh-huh. And you just happened to have 8 men available to come check on the situation?" "We take community safety seriously." Rodriguez let out a long breath. "Look, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I know who you are. I know what your club is about. Most of the time we're on different sides. But tonight," he paused, looking back at the house, "tonight you probably saved that woman's life. So I'm going to take your statement at face value. But Morrison, yeah, there's a right way and a wrong way to handle these things. You got lucky it didn't go sideways. Next time, call us first. With respect, officer. Next time a scared kid shows up crying about her mother being killed, I'm not going to waste time waiting for paperwork. That woman could have been dead by the time you got here." Rodriguez couldn't argue with that. He'd seen too many domestic violence calls that ended in body bags. Too many situations where by the time the system moved into action, it was too late. "Just stay out of trouble," he finally said. "Always do," Reaper replied with a slight smile. As the police finished their work and began to clear the scene, Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house next door. She was a small woman, bent with age, wrapped in a faded bathrobe. She walked directly up to Reaper. "I called the police twice before," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Twice. They came, they knocked, everyone said everything was fine, and they left. I heard that man hitting her. I heard that little girl crying, and I didn't know what else to do." Reaper's expression softened. "You did what you could, ma'am. It wasn't enough, but what you did tonight, what you boys did, that was enough. That was what needed to happen. I don't care what anyone says about your club. You did the right thing." Other neighbors began approaching, adding their voices. The Johnsons admitted they'd heard the fights, expressed their shame at not intervening. A young couple from across the street said they'd been debating calling the police themselves tonight. Everyone had known, everyone had heard, and everyone had convinced themselves it wasn't their place to act. Preacher, standing nearby, spoke up. "System's broken when it takes a bunch of outlaws to do what decent people should have done months ago." The crowd went quiet at that. It was an uncomfortable truth. This neighborhood, like so many others, had adopted a culture of willful ignorance. Don't get involved. Mind your own business. Don't be a snitch. All philosophies that sounded reasonable until you were 8 years old, running through the streets at night, desperate for someone to care enough to help. A news van pulled up, Channel 7. Rodriguez immediately moved to intercept them, but Tiny stepped in front of the reporter first. "No cameras in the kid's neighborhood," he said simply, out of respect for the family. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Martinez, wasn't intimidated. "This is a public street. We have a right to report the news. And that little girl has a right to not be made into a spectacle," Chains added. "Her mama has a right to not have cameras in her face on the worst night of her life. So you can report your news, but you're going to do it from down the block." Jessica looked at the wall of leather-clad men blocking her path, then at Officer Rodriguez, who simply shrugged. "They're not wrong," he said. "Victims' privacy should be protected. You can get the basic facts from me down the street." Reluctantly, the news crew moved away, but Jessica stopped and looked back at Reaper. "Can I ask you one question, off camera?" Reaper nodded. "Why? Why did you get involved. This isn't exactly the kind of thing motorcycle clubs are known for. Reaper was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. We live in this neighborhood. We do business here. The people here, they're our people, whether they know it or not. And there's rules. You don't hit women. You don't hurt kids. Those aren't just our rules. Those are human rules. When someone breaks them, someone has to step up. Tonight, that was us. But aren't you worried about legal consequences, about being accused of taking the law into your own hands? We didn't take anything into our own hands, Chains interjected. We responded to a cry for help. We secured a scene. We called the proper authorities. That's called being a good citizen. Jessica wasn't buying it entirely, but she also couldn't argue with the results. A woman was safe. A child would sleep without fear tonight. A violent man was in custody. Whatever the bikers' methods or motivations, the outcome was better than what the system had produced with 2 previous police visits. As she walked away to file her report, Spider turned to Reaper. That's going to be on the news tomorrow. Club's going to have opinions. Let them have opinions, Reaper said. We did right. Anyone has a problem with that can take it up at church. Church being what the club called their official meetings. Back at the clubhouse, Keisha had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in Linda's blanket, her small hand still clutching the empty hot chocolate mug. Linda gently removed it, brushing the girl's hair back from her face. She'd raised 3 kids of her own, all grown now, and the maternal instinct never really left. Big John sat in a chair nearby, his massive frame somehow making the furniture look like dollhouse furniture. Kid's been through hell, he said quietly. What happens to her now? Linda looked up. That depends on her mother. If Sarah's smart, she'll press charges, get a restraining order, rebuild her life. But it won't be easy. These situations never are. What if that piece of trash gets out on bail, comes back? Then we'll deal with it. Linda's voice was matter of fact. She'd been around the club long enough to know that protection didn't end when the immediate threat was neutralized. But first things first. Let's get through tonight. The sound of motorcycles announced the return of the brothers. They filed back into the clubhouse, their energy different now. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a quieter satisfaction. The satisfaction that comes from doing something that actually matters. Reaper looked down at the sleeping child on the couch. She say anything else while we were gone? Told me about school, her favorite subjects. Said she wants to be a teacher when she grows up. Linda smiled sadly. Sweet kid. Too smart to have to deal with what she's been dealing with. Mama's at the hospital, Reaper told her. They're checking her over, documenting injuries. Marcus is in custody. Social services will probably get involved, which means we need to be smart about the next steps. Spider pulled up a chair. What are the next steps? We can't just drop this kid back into that house and hope everything works out. No, Reaper agreed. We can't, but we also can't overstep. The system has to work now. We forced their hand, got them involved. Now they have to do their job. Chains came over with a cup of coffee, his knuckles bruised from where he'd grabbed Marcus. System doesn't always work. You know that better than anyone. I do, which is why we're going to make sure it does this time. Reaper pulled out his phone. I know a lawyer, good one, does pro bono work for domestic violence cases. We're going to make sure Sarah has representation. We're going to make sure she has resources, and we're going to make sure Marcus Wheeler understands that if he comes anywhere near that woman or her kid again, the police won't be his biggest problem. The threat hung in the air, unspoken, but understood by everyone in the room. There were consequences to breaking the club's code. Legal consequences were just the beginning. Tank, the youngest member, spoke up. I've been thinking. My old lady's cousin works for a women's shelter downtown. They help women transition out of abusive situations. Housing assistance, job placement, counseling. Maybe we connect Sarah with them? Reaper nodded approvingly. Good thinking. Make that call tomorrow. I got a buddy who does security installation, Hammer added. Once she's back in that house, assuming she stays there, we make sure she's got proper locks, maybe a camera system, something that gives her peace of mind. The offers kept coming. Preacher knew someone in social services who could navigate the system. Ghost's sister was a therapist who specialized in trauma. One by one, these men who society labeled as criminals, who wore patches that declared them outlaws, were assembling a support system for a woman and child they'd never met before tonight. It was nearly midnight when Sarah was released from the hospital. She'd been examined, photographed, documented, 2 cracked ribs, extensive bruising, a concussion. The medical report would be damning evidence in court, assuming the case made it that far. A uniformed officer drove her to the clubhouse to reunite her with Keisha. When the patrol car pulled up, Sarah was hesitant to get out. The clubhouse house, with its intimidating exterior and the row of motorcycles parked outside, looked like the last place a woman in her situation should go. But Officer Rodriguez, who'd insisted on personally escorting her, gently encouraged her. "They're waiting for you inside. Your daughter is safe, and believe it or not, you're among friends." Sarah entered the clubhouse slowly, her body aching with every step. The interior was not what she expected. Yes, there were the stereotypical elements: motorcycle memorabilia on the walls, leather and denim everywhere, the smell of motor oil and cigarettes. But there was also something else, something almost domestic: photos of families, a well-maintained bar that looked more like someone's finished basement than a den of criminals. And there, on the couch, her daughter sleeping peacefully. "Keisha," Sarah breathed, moving as quickly as her injured body would allow. Linda stood up, making room. "She's fine, worn out but fine. Brave girl you've got there." Sarah knelt by the couch, tears streaming down her face as she stroked her daughter's hair. Keisha stirred, opened her eyes, and when she saw her mother, she burst into tears and wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck. "Mama, you're okay! I was so scared." "I'm okay, baby. I'm okay. You saved me. You know that? You saved us both." The reunion was emotional enough that even the hardened bikers in the room found themselves looking away, giving the moment privacy. Big John cleared his throat roughly. Chains suddenly needed to check something on his motorcycle outside. After a few minutes, Reaper approached gently. "Mom, I'm Tommy Morrison. We spoke briefly earlier." Sarah looked up at him, still holding Keisha. "I don't know how to thank you, all of you. If Keisha hadn't found you, if you hadn't come..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You don't need to thank us, but you do need to know something. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Sarah's face showed fear. "What do you mean?" "I mean Marcus Wheeler is going to make bail, probably in the next day or two. He's going to be angry, humiliated. Men like him, they don't take this kind of thing well. You're going to need protection, you're going to need support, and you're going to need to be smart about the next steps." Reaper sat down across from her and laid it out. The legal process, the restraining order she needed to file immediately, the importance of following through with prosecution, the reality that the system would try to talk her into dropping charges, into reconciliation, into giving him another chance, and the even harder reality that Marcus would likely try to manipulate her into doing exactly that. He'll say he's changed, that he'll get help, that he loves you, that he can't live without you, that it'll be different this time. Reaper's voice was gentle but firm, and part of you might want to believe him, because despite everything, you probably still have feelings for him. That's normal, but you cannot go back, not ever, because next time, Keisha might not make it here in time. Next time, he might kill you. Sarah was crying now, not just from pain, but from the weight of what was happening. Her life was changing in ways she couldn't fully process yet. The man she'd lived with for 2 years was gone. The future she'd imagined, however flawed, was gone. Everything was different now. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Linda, who'd been standing nearby, sat down next to her. "You ran away from him tonight. You told the truth to the police. You're sitting here injured and scared, and you're still holding your daughter and thinking about tomorrow. You're already stronger than you know." "But where do I even start? I can't afford a lawyer. I can't afford to move. I work 2 jobs just to keep that house. If I press charges, if this goes to court, I could lose everything." "You won't," Tank said, stepping forward. "My old lady's cousin runs a women's shelter. They help with housing, with legal stuff, with job placement. I'll connect you tomorrow. And I know a lawyer," Reaper added. "She does this kind of work for free. She's good, and she doesn't lose. I'll make sure she takes your case. We'll handle the security for your house," Hammer said. "Locks, cameras, the works, no charge." One by one, the bikers outlined the support they were prepared to provide. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity, it was simply what they did for their community. The code demanded it. Sarah looked around at these men, these supposed outlaws, who were offering her more help in one night than she'd received in 2 years of suffering in silence. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this for us? You don't even know us." Reaper was quiet for a moment. "Few years back," he finally said, "my sister was in a situation like yours. Different city, different circumstances, but the same basic story. Husband beat her for 3 years. No one helped, no one intervened. By the time we found out, by the time we got to her," he paused, "she didn't make it. He killed her on a Tuesday afternoon while the neighbors listened through the walls and did nothing. The room went silent. Even the members who knew the story felt the weight of it again. So yeah," Reaper continued, "we know you. We know your story because we've lived it, and we made a decision after my sister died. Never again, not Not in our neighborhood, not on our watch. The code says you protect women and children. For us, that's not just words. That's who we are. Sarah understood then. This wasn't random. This wasn't just tough guys playing hero. This was personal. This was a brotherhood that had seen the worst of what men could do and had decided to stand against it. Law or no law, society's opinion or not. Officer Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Johnson, I need to speak with you about next steps. The conversation that followed was procedural but important. Restraining order paperwork would be filed first thing in the morning. Marcus would be arraigned within 48 hours. Sarah would need to give a formal statement. There would be a court case, probably taking months to resolve. And if he posts bail, Sarah asked, then he's prohibited from coming anywhere near you or your daughter. If he violates that, he goes back to jail immediately. But how will anyone know if he violates it unless something happens to me? That was the question that haunted every domestic violence case. A piece of paper couldn't stop a determined abuser. It could only punish them after they'd already done the damage. We'll know, Reaper said quietly. Trust me on that. Rodriguez shot him a warning look but didn't argue. Everyone in that room knew what Reaper meant. The Hell's Angels would be watching, and if Marcus Wheeler was stupid enough to come back, his legal problems would be the least of his concerns. As the night wore on and arrangements were made for Sarah and Keisha to stay with Linda and Reaper temporarily rather than returning to the house tonight, word of what had happened began to spread, not just in the neighborhood, but throughout the broader Oakland community and even within the extended Hell's Angels network. The response was mixed. Some praised the intervention. Others questioned whether the club should have gotten involved in what was technically a domestic dispute. There were concerns about legal exposure, about attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement, about stepping outside the traditional boundaries of club business. But among the members who'd been there, who'd seen Keisha's terrified face, who'd heard Sarah's story, who'd witnessed Marcus Wheeler's pathetic attempts at intimidation, there was no doubt they'd done the right thing, the only thing, and they'd do it again. As dawn approached and Keisha and Sarah finally fell asleep in the guest bedroom of Reaper's house, the brothers gathered one more time in the clubhouse. They were tired, some were bruised, all were processing the night's events. This is going to change things, Spider observed. People are going to look at us different now, some good, some bad. Let them look, Chain said. We know who we are. Still, Preacher added, we need to be prepared. Marcus has friends. He has family. This isn't over, Reaper nodded. I know, which is why we rotate watch on Sarah's house once she moves back in. We make sure the neighborhood knows she's under our protection. And we make sure Marcus Wheeler knows that coming back is not an option. What if he does anyway? Tank asked. The silence that followed answered the question better than words could. There were lines you didn't cross, and if you crossed them anyway, there were consequences. The sun rose over Oakland, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A new day, a new beginning for Sarah and Keisha, and a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts and laws and proper procedures. Sometimes it comes from unlikely places, from people society has written off, from a code that values protection over permission. The little girl who knocked on the clubhouse door had set something in motion that night, something that would ripple through the community for months and years to come. She'd shown extraordinary courage in her moment of greatest fear, and in return, she'd found exactly what her mother had promised her. Men who, despite their reputation, despite their patches and their motorcycles and their outlaw status, had one rule that superseded all others. You protect the neighborhood. You protect women and children. No exceptions, no excuses. 3 days after that Thursday night in September, Marcus Wheeler stood before a judge for his arraignment. His face showed the bruises of his arrest, his posture the deflation of a man whose power had evaporated. His public defender, a tired-looking woman in her 30s, handling her 15th case of the day, requested bail be set at $5,000. The prosecutor, a veteran named Catherine Chen, who'd seen too many domestic violence cases end in tragedy, objected. She presented Sarah's medical records, photographs of her injuries, the statement from 8-year-old Keisha describing years of escalating abuse, the police reports from Mrs. Patterson's previous calls that had gone nowhere. Your Honor, Chen argued, this defendant represents a clear and present danger to the victim. He has a history of violence, he has made threats, and he has demonstrated complete disregard for the victim's safety and well-being. The people request bail be set at $50,000 and that a no-contact order be strictly enforced. Marcus's lawyer tried to argue. Her client client was a working man. He had no prior record. This was an isolated incident blown out of proportion. But Judge Maria Santos, who'd been on the bench for 20 years and had presided over 3 cases where women had been killed by partners who'd been released on low bail, wasn't buying it. Bail is set at $50,000. The defendant is prohibited from any contact, direct or indirect, with the victim or her minor child. He is to stay at least 1,000 feet away from the victim's residence, place of employment, and the child's school. If the defendant violates this order in any way, bail will be revoked immediately. Do you understand, Mr. Wheeler? Marcus nodded sullenly. $50,000 meant he'd need $5,000 to post bail through a bondsman. Money he didn't have. Money his construction worker friends couldn't raise. He was going to sit in county jail until trial, which could take months. As he was led out of the courtroom, he scanned the gallery. Sarah wasn't there, but someone else was. Tommy Reaper Morrison sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching. Their eyes met for just a moment. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message was clear. Outside the courthouse, Reaper met with Catherine Chen and Sarah's new attorney, a fierce advocate named Rebecca Torres, who'd built her career defending domestic violence survivors. "How's Sarah doing?" Rebecca asked. "Scared, determined, taking it one day at a time. She's staying with my wife and me until we can get her into more permanent housing. The shelter Tank's girlfriend connected us with has an opening next week," Rebecca said. "It's transitional housing. She can stay there for up to 6 months while she gets back on her feet. They'll help with job placement, childcare, counseling." "What about the house?" Reaper asked. "Lease is in her name only. Marcus has no legal right to it. We're changing the locks today, installing the security system Hammer arranged. Once she's ready, she can move back in, though honestly, a fresh start somewhere new might be healthier." Catherine Chen pulled out a folder. "I wanted you to know, Marcus's lawyer is already talking about a plea deal. Assault and battery, reduced charges, probation, anger management classes, standard playbook. And you're going to take it?" Reaper's voice was neutral, but there was steel underneath. "Hell no. This goes to trial. I want this on his record permanently. I want him to serve real time. Men like Marcus Wheeler, they don't change with a few anger management classes. They need to face real consequences." "Good," Reaper said simply. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in the neighborhood. The silence that had enabled Marcus's abuse for 2 years was replaced by something else. Awareness, action, community. Mrs. Patterson became a regular visitor to Sarah's house, bringing casseroles and offering to babysit Keisha. The Johnsons apologized for their previous inaction and made it clear they'd be watching out for Sarah and her daughter. Other neighbors stopped by with support, with resources, with simple human kindness that had been absent when it was most needed. The local news coverage of the incident had been extensive. Channel 7 ran a feature piece titled "Unlikely Heroes: How Motorcycle Club Intervened in Domestic Violence Case." The report was balanced, acknowledging the complexity of the situation while highlighting the positive outcome. Jessica Martinez, the reporter who'd been there that night, interviewed several community members. The responses were telling. "I always thought of them as troublemakers," one neighbor admitted. "But they did what none of us had the courage to do. They didn't look away. People are scared of the Hells Angels," Mrs. Patterson told the camera. "But that little girl wasn't scared to ask them for help, and they came through when it mattered. That tells you something." The coverage sparked a broader conversation about domestic violence intervention, about community responsibility, about the failure of systems to protect vulnerable people. Op-eds appeared in the Oakland Tribune. Local activists began organizing. The police department announced new training protocols for responding to domestic violence calls, but not everyone saw the incident positively. Marcus's family, predictably, defended him. His mother gave interviews claiming Sarah had provoked him, that the whole thing was exaggerated. His brother posted angry rants on social media about biker gangs terrorizing innocent people. More concerning were the online threats. Sarah received messages telling her she'd destroyed a good man's life, that she was a liar, that she deserved what she got. The dark underbelly of victim blaming revealed itself in comment sections and social media posts. The Hells Angels dealt with these threats the way they dealt with most things, directly. When one particularly aggressive online troll was identified as someone who actually lived in Oakland, Spider and Ghost paid him a visit. They didn't threaten, they didn't touch him. They simply explained very clearly that continuing to harass Sarah would be considered unwise. The harassment stopped. For Keisha, the adjustment was complex. On one hand, she no longer lived in fear. The constant tension in her home had been replaced by stability. Her mother was getting counseling, working with therapists to process years of trauma. They had support systems in place. They were safe. But Keisha also struggled. She had nightmares. She had trouble concentrating in school. She felt guilty, though she had no reason to. Linda, who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother, spent hours with her, helping her understand that none of what happened was her fault, that being brave enough to ask for help was the most courageous thing she could have done. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after that Thursday night, Keisha asked Linda if she could visit the clubhouse. She wanted to thank the men properly. She'd written thank you cards for each of them, spending hours decorating them with crayons and stickers. When she arrived with Sarah and Linda, the tough bikers who'd faced down Marcus Wheeler without flinching found themselves emotional over a child's handmade cards. Big John actually had to leave the room for a moment. Overcome, Reaper knelt down to Keisha's level. "You know what you did that night?" he asked her. She shook her head. "You saved your mama's life, and you showed all of us what real courage looks like. Being scared, but doing the right thing anyway. That's the definition of brave." "But I was so scared," Keisha admitted. "I didn't know if you'd help us. Sometimes the scariest thing is asking for help, but you did it anyway. That makes you tougher than most adults I know." As months passed, the case against Marcus Wheeler moved forward. True to her word, Catherine Chen pushed for trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, police reports, testimony from neighbors, and most damning, Keisha's testimony about years of watching her mother suffer. Marcus's defense tried to paint Sarah as a vengeful ex-girlfriend, tried to claim the injuries were exaggerated, tried every tactic in the book. None of it worked. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Marcus Wheeler was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation with mandatory counseling and a permanent restraining order. It wasn't as much time as Catherine would have liked, but it was real time. Time that would give Sarah and Keisha space to truly rebuild. The day the verdict was announced, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps with Rebecca Torres and Catherine Chen. Reporters asked how she felt. "Relieved," she said simply. "For 2 years, I lived in fear. I made excuses. I convinced myself it would get better, but it never does on its own. If my daughter hadn't been brave enough to ask for help, if those men hadn't been willing to act, I don't know if I'd be standing here today." "What would you say to other women in similar situations?" a reporter asked. Sarah looked directly into the camera. "I'd say this: it's not your fault. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting, and you deserve better, but you can't wait for it to get better on its own. You have to ask for help. You have to be willing to make hard choices, and you have to remember that staying silent, staying scared, that's what abusers count on. Don't give them that power," Rebecca added. "And to communities, I'd say, stop looking away. Stop pretending domestic violence is a private matter. Stop waiting for someone else to intervene. The Hells Angels didn't wait. They acted, and that action saved lives. We need more of that, not less." The impact of that September night rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The Hells Angels, particularly the Oakland chapter, found themselves in an unusual position. They were still outlaws in the eyes of the law. They were still involved in activities that existed in legal gray areas, but they were also recognized as protectors of their community in a way that transcended their traditional reputation. Other chapters heard the story. It spread through the national network of motorcycle clubs, and in cities across America, similar interventions began happening. A woman in Portland being stalked by an ex-boyfriend found sanctuary with a local club. A teenager in Phoenix being abused by a stepfather was protected by bikers who ensured the authorities followed through. It wasn't organized. There was no official policy. But the code, that unwritten rule about protecting women and children, was reinforced and strengthened by what happened in Oakland. Law enforcement's relationship with the club became more complicated. They were still adversaries in many ways, but there was also grudging respect. Officer Rodriguez, who'd been there that first night, occasionally found himself working cooperatively with club members on community issues. It was an uneasy alliance, but it existed. For Sarah and Keisha, life slowly found a new normal. Sarah moved back into her house after the security upgrades were complete. She got a better job through contacts the shelter provided. She continued counseling. She started volunteering at a domestic violence hotline, using her experience to help other women find their courage. Keisha thrived. thrived. Without the constant stress and fear, her grades improved. She made new friends. She joined the school's art club and discovered a talent for drawing. And every few weeks, she'd ask her mother if they could visit the clubhouse to say hello to the men who'd helped them. Those visits became something of a tradition. Keisha would show up with new drawings, usually of motorcycles, which ended up taped to the clubhouse walls. The bikers would show her their bikes, teach her about engines, treat her like the little sister they'd never had. On the first anniversary of that Thursday night, Sarah organized a small gathering at the clubhouse. Nothing formal, just pizza and beer for the adults, soda for the kids. A simple thank you to the men who'd changed their lives. As they sat around talking, Keisha, now 9 years old and far more confident than the terrified child who'd knocked on that door a year ago, stood up. "I want to say something," she announced. The room quieted. "Before, I was scared all the time. I was scared for my mama. I was scared of him. I was scared of everything. And then that night, I didn't know what else to do. So I ran here. And you helped us. You saved us. And now I'm not scared anymore." She looked around at the tough, weathered faces of men who'd lived hard lives, made questionable choices, but who'd been there when it mattered most. "My teacher asked us to write about heroes, about people who make a difference. And I wrote about all of you because you're my heroes. Not because you're tough or because you ride motorcycles, but because when a scared little girl knocked on your door crying, you didn't turn away. You helped." There wasn't a dry eye in that clubhouse. Big John had to leave the room again. Chains cleared his throat roughly and suddenly needed to check something outside. Even Reaper, who'd seen and done things that would haunt most people, found himself emotional. Linda put her arm around Sarah. "You raised a good kid." "She raised herself, in a lot of ways," Sarah replied quietly. "She had to grow up too fast, but she's going to be okay. We both are." As the evening wore on and stories were shared, laughter echoed off the clubhouse walls. It was a sound of healing, of community, of unlikely connections formed in crisis and strengthened through time. Later, as Sarah and Keisha prepared to leave, Reaper walked them to their car. "You know," he said, "what happened that night? It changed us too. Reminded us what matters, why we have the code in the first place." "Thank you," Sarah said, "for everything, for responding, for following through, for being there. That's what we do," Reaper said simply. "That's who we are." As they drove away, Keisha looked back at the clubhouse, at the men standing outside waving goodbye, at the motorcycles gleaming under the streetlights. "Mama," she said. "Yeah, baby. I'm glad we're safe now, and I'm glad we know them." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The story of the little girl who knocked on the clubhouse door became legendary in Oakland. It was told and retold, sometimes accurately, sometimes embellished, but the core truth remained constant. A child asked for help. Adults answered. A woman was saved. A community was changed. And a motorcycle club demonstrated that heroism doesn't always look the way society expects it to. Years later, when Keisha was in high school, she wrote an essay for a scholarship competition about courage and community. She described that night in detail. The fear, the desperation, the decision to trust strangers, and the men who proved worthy of that trust. She won the scholarship. The essay was published in a local magazine. And once again, the story spread, inspiring conversations about domestic violence, about intervention, about the responsibility we all have to protect the vulnerable. Marcus Wheeler served his 5 years. Upon release, he violated his probation within 6 months and was sent back to prison. He never returned to Oakland. Word had spread in ways that transcended legal orders. He knew, in a way that went beyond mere knowing, that returning would be a mistake he wouldn't survive. The Hells Angels, Oakland chapter, continued their work. They weren't reformed. They weren't suddenly law-abiding citizens. They were what they'd always been, outlaws with a code. Men who existed outside society's rules, but within their own strict moral framework. And at the center of that framework, reinforced by that September night and the little girl's courage, was a simple principle. You protect women and children, not sometimes, not when it's convenient, always. Other domestic violence situations arose in the neighborhood. Not all of them ended at the clubhouse door, but the word had spread. If you needed help, real help, there were people who would act. The culture of silence that had enabled Marcus's abuse for 2 years was broken. Neighbors paid attention. People spoke up. Intervention happened faster. It wasn't perfect. The system was still flawed, but it was better. And that improvement could be traced directly back to a Thursday evening in September, when a terrified 8-year-old girl made the bravest decision of her young life. On that anniversary gathering, as the evening wound down and people began to leave, preachers Keisha pulled Reaper aside. "You know," he said, "we've done a lot in our time with this club. Some good, some not so good, some things we're proud of, some things we're not. But this is the thing I'll be most proud of when I'm old and looking back." Reaper nodded. "Same, because this mattered. This was real. This was what the code is actually about, stripped down to its essence. Think it'll change how people see us? Some people, maybe. Most won't care. We're still outlaws to them, still criminals, still the guys their mothers warned them about." He smiled slightly. "But Keisha knows different. Sarah knows different. And everyone in this neighborhood who heard that story knows different. That's enough." It was enough. Because at the end of the day, the Hells Angels didn't ride for society's approval. They rode for each other, for their brotherhood, and for the code they'd sworn to uphold. And on that Thursday night in September 1997, they'd upheld it in the most important way possible. They'd answered a child's desperate cry for help. They'd intervened when others wouldn't. They'd stood between a victim and her abuser. And they'd sent a message that echoed far beyond one neighborhood in Oakland. Some lines you don't cross, some people you don't hurt. And if you do, there are consequences. The little girl who knocked on the clubhouse door grew up to become a teacher, just as she'd dreamed. She specialized in working with at-risk youth, with children from troubled homes, with kids who needed someone to see them, to hear them, to believe them. And in her classroom, prominent on the wall, hung a photo, a group of leather-clad bikers standing with a woman and a young girl all smiling. Underneath, a caption, "Heroes come in all forms. Sometimes you find them in the most unexpected places." Her students would ask about the photo, and she'd tell them the story about fear and courage, about asking for help, about people who lived outside the law but inside a code that valued protection above all else. About a Thursday night that changed everything, and in telling that story, she'd pass on the most important lesson she'd learned. Never be afraid to ask for help, because somewhere, someone is waiting to answer. So what's your take on this incredible story? Do you believe the Hells Angels did the right thing, or should they have left it to the authorities? Would you have had the courage to do what they did? Would you have had the courage to do what Keisha did? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective on this controversial act of street justice and community intervention. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you real stories that make you think, feel, and question. Stories that show the complexity of human nature and the unexpected ways heroism manifests in our world. And before you go, check out our next recommended video. Another extraordinary tale you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.